Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm looking forward to working with you and with my good friend, the ranking member, Senator Brown. You know, we all share a common goal, and that is to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. At this moment, I believe our ongoing negotiations with Iran are our best hope for achieving that goal and should be our first priority, since undermining those negotiations risks escalation and risks the possibility of war. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today about whether the proposed new sanctions legislation will be helpful or harmful to that goal. And with that, I yield the rest of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned earlier, we are all committed to a common goal: prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Right now, I believe our ongoing negotiations with Iran are the best hope for achieving that goal, and they should be our first priority, since undermining those negotiations risks escalation and risks the possibility of war. Now, Congress would gladly give our negotiators more leverage in these talks, but the President has repeatedly stated that if Iran violates the interim deal or if the talks fall apart, he will immediately call for new sanctions, and we know that Congress would be ready to add more immediately. So, Deputy Secretary Blinken, I just want to be clear on this point. If Congress passes another sanctions bill now during ongoing negotiations, will that give our negotiators any new leverage?
In our judgment, no.
Thank you. I agree, and I just don't see the upside to passing a bill now. So let's talk about the downside. Deputy Secretary, let's be clear on this one. Would passing a sanctions bill now strengthen or weaken hardliners inside the Iranian government who are hoping to blow up the negotiations?
We would be concerned that the passage of new sanctions now would reinforce the hand of hardliners and weaken the hand of more pragmatic elements who are trying to get to an agreement.
Thank you. We also need to consider the impact of a sanctions bill on our international partners, as you've mentioned earlier. Two experts and former Treasury officials wrote in the New York Times that it was the cooperation of our partners all around the world, quote, rather than the severity of American sanctions alone that delivered results, close quote, in the negotiations with Iran. But just recently, the foreign ministers of France, Britain, Germany, and the European Union all wrote that the new American sanctions, quote, might also fracture the international coalition that has made sanctions so effective so far. So, Undersecretary, if Congress passed new sanctions legislation now, how would that affect the willingness of our international partners to hang together to enforce the current sanctions?
Well, I think that what the foreign minister said in that piece is a real concern, that their willingness to hang with us, to voluntarily work with us to impose sanctions could be compromised. And it's a risk that is not worth taking, since it doesn't provide us additional leverage at the negotiating table.
All right. And last, if diplomacy fails, we'll have to move to other options, because all of us agree that an Iran nuclear weapon is unacceptable. So let's talk about what happens if the negotiations fail. If the United States had passed new sanctions legislation before that happened, would it be easier or harder for us to maintain an international coalition to work together to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon?
In our judgment, it could well be harder. It would certainly run the risk of muddying the waters and creating confusion among the coalition, and in effect, we'd end up arguing amongst ourselves instead of keeping the focus on Iran.
All right, so thank you. We have every reason to be skeptical about the Iranian government, and I think that's been made clear today. But our number one goal is to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. If new legislation gives us no extra leverage, and it increases the risk that the negotiations will blow up, and it makes it harder for us to hold together an international coalition to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, then I just can't support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.